I'm super excited to have you join for today. Kicking off, like a very general question, but like why are biomarkers of relevance for every insurance company? Why have you been addressing that opportunity as a company, and how has it gained more research traction in the last few years for SCORE?
Yeah, I mean, when we started the transformation process, I would say about 4 years ago in the life division of SCORE Reinsurance, and we thought, I mean, in these at that point already emerging ecosystems, we said, what is our role? What do we bring to the table, and what is the value we are adding for people? And if you think about it, then it's protecting life, but also protecting the way you live while you're still alive. I mean, if you think about disability insurance, nobody wants these annuities if you get disabled. You want to stay healthy, you want to be an active part in your community and things like that. And then we asked ourselves, I mean, what can we do to keep people healthier in the long run? I mean, for sure, it also helps our balance sheets. I mean, there is no need to hide that, but it goes back to doing good for the people. And I mean, if you want to measure the progress, then you're quickly at measuring biomarkers and hopefully measuring the improvement of certain things like a decrease in the resting heart rate or a higher active calories burned per day, or very simply the number of steps taken. So this is where we are coming from.
Very interesting. Debbie, like I'll let you take the next stab on this one, because we're curious to see, why is this of interest for a ventures fund? What are you looking at, and how do you see that as a fit for Boehringer Ingelheim?
Yeah, so just wanted to kind of provide a little background. So Boehringer Ingelheim, it's a large global pharmaceutical company. We're one of the top 20 in the world. And so I come from the corporate venture side, where I make digital health investments on behalf of the fund. So we both, for the fund, we both are therapeutic investors as well as digital health investors. So I lead the digital health investments in North America. We make early stage investments, whereby we would put in, say, a few $100,000 up to a few million into an early stage investments. These primarily are seed to Series A or even pre-seed. And so what we like to do is we get in very, very early, when the companies are just forming, in order to make an investment. And the reason why we do this as a part of a pharmaceutical company is really, not only to start early, but also to kind of help shape the company. And to answer kind of your question is, why biomarkers and why do we make our investments the way we do? So we may be very different from a regular institutional investor or an investor in a different industry. Our investments are strategic to the strategic interests of our pharma company. And what does a pharma company do? It makes drugs, right? And we basically want to make sure that the patients do well on our drugs. We want to understand how they respond on the drugs, how we can keep patients in clinical trials so that they are retained and we can better monitor them. How do we stratify the patients? So having access to biomarkers in order to answer all these questions, as well as maybe diagnose a patient. How do we diagnose patients better where there are no technologies that are non-invasive to date, maybe, where we can get sort of non-invasive technologies to better monitor and understand and diagnose patients, for example, with Alzheimer's. There's no current way of finding out other than through PET scans, and even that's not very accurate, of determining whether or not someone's going to have Alzheimer's or not. Understanding risk. So those are the reasons why we want to use biomarkers, is to find novel ways to better understand how patients do through their disease and through monitoring them on medications. And that's all in light of driving better healthcare. So it's a more complicated answer to your question.
No, that's perfectly fine. I think you talked a little bit about like the different, let's say, like diseases that you can detect, like Alzheimer's and all these chronic diseases. And I know SCORE has set the ambition to move away from pay and pray, that no one makes use of the claims towards pay and prevent. And Sven, what are like the use cases you keep exploring? What are the chronic diseases you try to like research on at this point? What is it that you are most interested in at this point, and what can we expect in the short term or long run to take speed?
Yeah, I mean, the current use case is this what we call biological age model. It's not tailored to a specific disease, but I mean, it's an algorithm which determines the decreases in mortality or morbidity based on your physical activities. So saying normal American citizen walks around 4,000 steps a day. And our research shows if you walk 8,000 steps a day, then your mortality decreases by around 20%. And now the tricky part is, how do you get people from 4,000 steps to 8,000 steps? And this is also kind of a venture for us, because we are now looking into behavioral economics. What does it really take to get people from these 4 to these 8,000 steps? And I mean, answering your question, so our focus currently is on physical activity, and then the greatest implications are on cardiovascular risks, meaning you're talking heart attack, you're talking stroke. But of course, what Debbie just said, maybe about Alzheimer, I mean, it would be great to tackle such a thing in the future. And I mean, there are studies that you might see in the patterns how people move, that they are in early stage Alzheimer. But I would really say this is maybe something like 5 years away. Currently, it's physical activity, cardiovascular risks. This is what we already understand pretty well. And maybe to close it off, I mean, my final goal would be to see something in the data for cancer, because it's still a dreadful thought that you could wake up one day not feeling well, go to the doctor and be dead in 4 weeks. This is just, it's dreadful. So if we can come there, I mean, it will take another 10 years at least, but that would be the ultimate goal.
Thank you very much, Sven. And I see Sev has joined us just now as well. Sev, thanks very much for tuning in. We're actually just talking a little bit about the use cases for using AI for biomarkers. I know you, as the transformation officer, you deal with a lot of different groups, and we're just curious maybe to tune in, and what are some examples that you see currently make a difference for patient care at this point? Where do you see that this has potential?
Well, I think I've been able to listen in. I just wasn't able to speak, but so I heard some of the responses, and it, very much along the same lines. I think this notion of identifying bad outcomes before they happen. So predicting, for instance, just starting even with chronic disease, someone has heart failure or diabetes, and being able to predict that this person is at a high risk of having an acute event, ending up in an emergency room, ending up in a hospital. This is, first of all, it's doable and it's possible, and yet it's not state of the care yet, and it should be. And to the point that was just made, I mean, this is life-saving work that we can be doing and should be doing. So I think that's one avenue. Just in the hospital system, this is very, very acute. The notion that, for instance, if you are in the hospital and sepsis is a big problem, people getting infections, we detect sepsis now, well, at least we used to, just literally when someone had a fever and their blood pressure was dropping, it was already too late. You're behind the 8 ball. You're getting them into the ICU, and the rate of mortality is extremely high, especially in older people. Well, now we know we can actually predict sepsis not only hours, probably days ahead of time. We're seeing with AI the ability for the machinery and machine learning to pick up variations, fluctuations in temperature, fluctuations in breathing, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's in the hospital. In coming to the hospital, one of the use cases I love, which we're actually using right now, is when you have a stroke, time is absolutely critical. The time to actually break that clot means the difference between having a brain and not having a brain, and after the acute stroke. And so seconds count, minutes count. And so before that, you'd have someone come in, they'd go get an MRI scan or CT scan. Someone would have to read it, then have to get back to the ED. Now we have a system where literally the moment the MRI scan is read, the AI kicks in and automatically alerts the entire team to start to mobilize to get that blood clotting medication into that person's veins and arteries in a matter of a few minutes, again saving them brain cells and getting them back to recovery. So those are some acute examples. Again, on the less acute side, we're using it now to pick up, for instance, in NLP and natural language processing, the idea that you have people who are being seen over months or over years. Let's take one example like dementia. Well, the problem is that dementia doesn't get diagnosed till you're way down the path, but there's medications now where we have, and those that are in development, where if you identify it early, you can actually start treatment. You could start to direct some care to the patient ahead of time. Well, you could have AI looking at and through natural language processing to actually identify cognitive decline years ahead of time and actually do something. And so again, broad spectrum of utilization, not to say anything about imaging, in radiology using AI, in pathology, picking up cancer cells, in radiology, picking up cancerous nodules. We're even using it to identify acute otitis media, infections in the ear, by having machine learning learn how to identify what is an infection versus what is not. And so again, it just such a broad range of utilization. I go into detail in any of those.
Thank you very much, Zev. Maybe moving over to Debbie for a quick statement as well. We always perceive as the ventures initiatives as kind of the forerunner in like new technologies and like the next big trends to come. And this is what our corporate partners often ask us, like which is the next technology that will be the groundbreaking solution that makes Zev's life easier and ultimately will help get Sven more data sources to make a better underwriting decision. But what do you like? What can you share? What do you see as the most promising in that space at this point?
I mean, promising is one thing. Another thing is speed. Biomarkers, definitely, this is a very timely topic. I mean, I think that the capabilities that technologies allow us today, especially with COVID, the unfortunateness of the epidemic, sort of having some silver lining and accelerating the uptake of remote monitoring tools, wearables, all of these things where we are used to telemedicine now, or more used to, being able to beam into a doctor through our laptops. I think that's definitely speeded up the acceptance of telehealth and digital health. And so that brings the capability of lots and lots of data from a lot of people beaming in from their homes. And so having that allows the speed of biomarker development to increase. If you think about sort of taking all of that different data types and processing all of it, because you may get data, but data is not just data. Data types, even using, for example, cameras, for dementia and Alzheimer's, we're looking into cameras where you could do a retinal scan and it can detect biomarkers in the eye in order to predict whether or not someone's going to have dementia. Well, there are different cameras out there. And if you use different cameras to get all the different data, they have to be standardized because different cameras have different, shutter speeds. They have different noise uptake, and so all of that image processing and labeling and all that is not a trivial task. And so you might have lots of data, but then how do you deal with all of that data, I think, is a huge challenge. And AI and software experts and all of that come in there, but it's not a challenge that's to be taken lightly. And then on the regulatory side of things, the FDA and the last administration has actually spurred, increased and lowered the barriers towards regulation, which is really, really good. And so that allows sort of a more informal discussion with the FDA, where you have this de novo process for getting breakthrough designation and reimbursement that may have come earlier now than before. So it's really increased the momentum of wearables and biomarker access. So I would say that's the most exciting. This topic is probably, at least for us, the most exciting.
Thank you very much for sharing, Debbie. Sven, I would like to maybe invite you to share a little bit on like data sharing, data access. Debbie mentioned it a little bit. I know that's like one of the big topics from all the enjoyers, like how difficult is it to get data? How easy is it to actually make use of data and leverage it for successful models? What do you see currently? I know you're based in Cologne, Germany, so there are probably different restrictions. Debbie mentioned a little bit the FDA regulations changing slightly towards more favorable use of telemedicine solutions, and we can talk a little bit more about this with Sev just in a little bit. But what is it for you? Like, what are the challenges? Is it from like data aggregation to data sourcing? But where is the potential and where are like still the struggles and the challenges for you at this point?
So maybe 2 or 3 different points to mention on that. Maybe first, getting back to Debbie, as she talked a bit also about the FDA. I mean, certainly data protection gets a lot heavier once you're in the medical sphere. So we as a reinsurance company try to stay out of giving any medical advice. I think this is something which would be done in an ecosystem by Debbie and her company or by SAFE, since they are the experts and should give medical advice. We see ourselves more on the prevention side, and talking about data, it makes things a lot easier for us. But still, and maybe that's the second point, still you have to comply to the data regulation laws, and but I do not see this as a pain. I see this as a necessity, and I think it's in our own best interest to do so and even exceed it and be a thought leader on what kind of data do we want to collect, how do we process this, and be open. Because I mean, I once heard a sentence which I found is very true from the Chief Risk Officer of Swiss Re, of our wonderful competitors, and he said, if this industry of ours is perceived as doing cherry picking and using data just to pick the good risks, then we are doomed. And I think and society is right to do so. And I think he's totally right on that one. So certainly data regulation is an issue, but it's a good one that it's there. In the actual work with data, I mean, currently, for us, the biggest challenge is to get the data we want. To go back to this biological age model, I mean, you need some data with, let's say, a follow-up period of 10, 15 years of physical activity of people. But 15 years ago, nobody thought that step data could be interesting in 15 years time. I mean, I'm always making that joke. If I would have known how important that kind of data would have been, then today I would not work anymore for SCOR. I mean, you could sell these data sets for millions and millions. So currently, the biggest challenge is to get data sets, because the meaningful ones are still very rare. I expect that to change with more and more data we are currently collecting. But that's then again a story for 3 or 4 years time. Currently, it's really getting the right data sets for us.
Interesting. Sev, I'm going to move over to you, because I know you have a lot to share when it comes to challenges too. Like, and your challenges are much different to probably Sven's and Debbie's from their experience, more from the data angle. But what do we see on like the patient care? Where do we see the use? Like you mentioned a little bit, the MRI scans that automatically detect a blood clot, and then immediately the caregivers can respond to this. But what are some general challenges that you see? Where do we struggle? What do we need to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a really, really important one. Before we touch that, I just want to touch upon the data. And what Debbie said before, and I think expedience is really interesting. I think that we're going to go where the data allows us to manipulate it easier without tripping all these regulatory or compliance privacy issues. So an example is, in small focused areas like that one I just mentioned, where the data doesn't have to go outside, you don't need to share it, it's all within one division, one unit. So another example of that, which we're doing too, which I have to say I really take my hat off to my colleagues. We just had at Atrium Health the first artificial intelligence tool for predicting hernia surgery outcomes. And again, all that data is kept close. It's not shared with anyone, but we're taking that patient data and literally from a CAT scan, we can now predict if a patient's going to need complicated procedure versus a straightforward procedure, which makes a big difference as well. We also can predict with like 90% accuracy if they're going to get an infection, which is remarkable again. So this is, and the data, the expedience of that allows us to do that, but it's really an exciting tool to be able to turn to someone and say, listen, you have a high risk of having an infection. We're going to have to do some things, or you may want to reconsider the surgery, or this is going to be a complicated surgery. And again, using artificial intelligence to do that is mind blowing. But it's also easier to do than having to share data or pull data across organizations, et cetera. Now, having said that, what's also really exciting, and I have to say, I just recently learned about this, is that one of the things about AI is you need lots of data, right, for machine learning and deep learning. And often you have to draw that data from across multiple institutions, multiple data sets. Also, the other problem is you want diversity. So it's not just like white men who are 50 years old. You need to have, different ethnic backgrounds, age backgrounds, et cetera. And so you're going to need to actually draw data from large data sets from multiple organizations. And privacy and compliance is a big issue. So one of the things that we've been doing here, actually, it comes from our legacy Wake Forest Baptist Health colleagues, is we've been doing this federated learning program where you can actually share the data without sharing it. So the data is actually being used by the machine learning, but it's not being shared, which is actually, again, really, really exciting. So we're learning, using the technology as a way to go around actually having to share the data and still get the benefits of all that data. So I think there's, again, I think data is, and all the problems around data and all the compliance problems are huge and significant. But I do think that I think they're being solved. And these are just two examples I just gave you that are happening here at Atrium Health. I do want to say, though, that technology is not the problem. Technology, the enablement of technology is there. We have tremendous research going on around the country and around the world. I think that there are some other problems. When you get to the clinical delivery of care, there are multiple issues you're going to have to deal with. And I think technologists and technology companies may be somewhat naive, even brilliant technologists and brilliant business people. Once you get into healthcare, it's a whole different world. And to know the various barriers and challenges. So let me just tick off a few. Obviously, we just talked about data and we just scratched the surface about data. But then the other issue is a small issue called payment. And I'm joking because it's not a small issue. AI requires, it's not just having a software program. You've got to embed the software program into electronic medical record systems so that people will actually use them. Because if they're not integrated into a system, no one's going to shut their computer or shut their screen and go into another screen and open up and they have to put in data. It's got to be, this money is time. And for providers and provider teams to use this stuff, it's got to be integrated so that you've got the integration challenge. Then I think you've got, the question is when you're investing all this money in taking this software and then integrating it and then building it into the systems and the flow and the workflow, all that has to happen. And then the question is, who's going to pay for all that, right? How is payment working? And so, that's now got to be, right now we work on a fee-for-service system where it's, in this country, at least in the United States, it's about volume. And so a lot of AI, as I see it today, is really about prevention. Again, you were talking about that, it's preventing bad things from happening. It's preventing ED visits and hospitalizations and higher cost things. And so, I think for a lot of the technology to be realized and to be deployed and to be used, once you get past all these other problems, you still have the problem of, is someone going to actually pay for it? And I think that's a larger systemic issue. But I know I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and startup companies, and it's the one thing they don't understand. I've got this great tool. It's going to save lives. It's going to prevent hospitalizations. It's going to identify things before time. It's going to reverse diabetes. Great. Who's going to pay for that? Who pays for prevention? And I think, again, in other parts of the world, I think they're further ahead. And in certain parts of this country, we're further ahead in terms of that, what we call value-based payment. But I think that's a major trip up. I think another one is also accountability, right? If the software makes a mistake, who's actually accountable for that, right? What's the ethics of that? And I think those are things that, again, as technologists, you're not thinking about that, but as provider groups and as a healthcare system, we have to think about all that stuff, starting from the integration to the payment, to the clinical workflows, to the accountability, to the ethics of it. So again, lots of barriers. I think they're surmountable. And again, the promise of AI is just huge. I'm for one, I'm so excited about where we are. And I know you and I have talked about the Gartner hype cycle and where we are in that, and we can come back to that, but I want to let the others respond to this.
Yes, happy to. No, Debbie, any thoughts from what he just shared? Is this like also aligned with what you're seeing currently, or is this like news to you? Because I always find it so inspiring that we bring all these different perspectives to one table, and I hope that everyone gets something out of it. Some immediate thoughts about what Zev just shared?
Yeah, no, there was a couple points I wanted to make based on what he said. Really, really interesting. Different highlights that he said you just mentioned. I want to start from sort of the last one, which was sort of the value-based payment. So I've been hearing a lot of companies now, healthcare is moving towards value-based payments, outcomes-based contracts, all of that. To do it is a little bit harder than than actually said, and so. I think with healthcare really focusing on that kind of triple aim, need to low cost, quality, and all of that. How do you structure outcomes-based payments? How do you structure value-based payments? And how do you do that in a way that allows you as a startup company to get your revenue on a timely basis? Because if you need to track outcomes, let's say it's diabetes, or let's say it's dementia, whatever it's chronic, these chronic diseases, the outcomes could be long time. So for you to get paid,
right,
you got to track those outcomes, let's say 6 months, a year. Does that mean that you get revenue a year later from something that you set up like a year before? How are you going to generate sales in the meantime? You can't wait a year to get revenue, right? And so all of these things need to be thought about, and sort of your short-term revenue, your long-term revenue. I think it's nice to say we want to structure value-based agreements, but how do you do that? And how do you track it in a way that's unbiased, and who's tracking it, and how does the healthcare company like the providers like Atrium believe? Why would they believe you? If all the data is sitting in your database, like who's to know whether or not the outcomes you're showing are real? And so that's a challenge for sure. The other point that was made was around federated learning. So this kind of comes into the process perspective points that Zev, you were making. Federated learning, blockchain, all of these ways to kind of pool data in a sort of more compliant way where you don't violate privacy. All of those federated learning contracts need to have like data use agreements, and each institution needs to negotiate that. So that's, how do you do that? Very difficult. Once you get organizations at the table, and big organizations, those are contract cycles and negotiations that could last like months and months and months. So just food for thought when you think about those kinds of things. And the last aspect is the bias topic. I was talking to an academic center over in Boston the other day. We were talking about women who wear wearables versus, or an iPhone in a purse versus an iPhone in a pocket. You know, the accelerometers are swinging like this because your purse moves like this. So how do you track steps when your movements are like this versus like, you know, when a guy has it in a pocket? It could be different. And, you know, we shouldn't underestimate the biases of our own smartphones and what they can pick up. I remember there was a story about BMW using voice activated systems in order to pick up you know, voice commands. They had trained their voice activated systems only on males. And so the systems couldn't understand female voices because the pitches were too high. And so those are sort of the biases that are built into devices that are not diverse enough, I guess. So just some interesting points.
Thank you very much, Debbie, for sharing. And that this is our kind of sign that we're about to wrap up. But Sven, I would like to give you the last words here, just the one sentence maybe or two, because I think Debbie just summarized very well the challenges of every insurance company that I work with in the life and health space. But any last word from your end? Like, do you agree with Debbie? Is there one more thing that we really should be considering? Like, how can we help you in the preventative space?
No, I totally agree with Debbie. Just to wrap it up in 2 sentences, once you enter the world of corporates, it's also about budgets and the question who pays. Absolutely. And the second question, point, going back to Cephas, I mean, large corporates, they have a reputational risk. There's something on the line, and if something goes wrong, you cannot just shut down a company which has a legacy of 100 years. And so the risk appetite might be different than that from a startup.
Great point.
Thank you very much. I think that's a wonderful handover. And then I assume if anyone wants to connect with you, we can facilitate those introductions. I think you're all on LinkedIn, so one can find you on there. Thank you very much again for joining us today. It was a pleasure hosting you all, and I hope we soon see each other, ideally in a in-person format. With that, I would hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Nathan. Nathan, are you going to take it over from here?